So good morning. Welcome everybody. So my name is Achille Fonzone. I'm Professor of Transport Analysis and Planning at Edinburgh University. I'm very pleased to be here to chair this session, and above all, I'm very pleased to see that the effort of ETP in developing a theme working on how to decarbonize, how to have a net zero mobility system. Pat, my colleague Pat, and the whole team and Napier, we are very happy to support also this effort. Because I think there is we have reduced the burden, let's say, of mobility for both for the planet and but also for the finance of households, of families. And this requires clearly, as we had also in the previous presentation, a multidisciplinary approach in which we go from psychology to technology. This has to be applied to all sectors of transport. So I think the session today will give a good overview of what is at stake in this effort, because both for the topic of the presentation and also the range of speakers, I think will give us a good introduction to the problem of mobility net zero in the next future. So the frame is very simple: 10 minutes or a bit longer presentation plus 5 minutes for questions. And I should mention that there will be a prize for the best presentation in the session. So without any further ado, I will move on to the first presentation, which is from Jenny Milne. And Jenny is from Aberdeen University. Is doing her PhD part-time there in the area of rural mobility as a service. Jenny is particularly proud, I think, to what she says, to practice what she preaches, because she's let's say, heavily involved in rural communities. She's the founder of the Scottish Rural and Islands Transport Community. She has worked in the ITS sector for 2 decades. If I understand correctly, from the whole, starting from developing solutions to implementing them, and the moment she also works as a freelance transport consultant. So the title of the presentation is Rural Mass, Testing Transport Technologies with Rural Stakeholders, which I think is an account of what happened in a stakeholder in rural Scotland about mass. So many thanks.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, I had to keep altering the microphone. Being a small person, I have to bring it down. As said, I'm a part-time PhD student, and you'll have to forgive me because the last time I actually did an in-person conference was ETP in 2019. So you're privileged, or I'm privileged enough to be here today. I'm going to take a slightly different spin to the question I asked in the plenary about decarbonisation. For me, the answer was very much more about the types of fuel that we have and how we can change the vehicles. I'm actually more looking at the person and the people and us, everybody in the room. We're all customers, consumers of transport. So I'm going more from this bottom-up approach. As I said, I'm at University of Aberdeen. My supervisors are Mark Beecroft, who's at Aberdeen, Phil Greening, some of you may know from Heriot Watt, John Nelson's actually out at Sydney, and Steve Wright's Aberdeen University. And sadly, I actually lost my main supervisor, Caitlin Cottrell, who some of you may know, back in May. So it's not been the easiest of years. So to give you some idea, you might not be familiar with the term mobility as a service, but it's very, as a concept, discussed in an urban area. So it's more about taking your phone or your credit card and using that to be able to get all of your services in one place at the same time, make it easy for you. And there's various different ways of looking at it. Do you pay as you go? Do you bundle it together? It's one of these bloody words, excuse my French, that has about 200 different definitions that nobody in any sector has actually come to agreement on. So that gives you a bit of a high level. But how does that actually work in rural areas? Because we don't have micromobility to the same extent as you do in urban areas. We don't have the public transport network as we do in urban areas. So how does this actually look? And the only work that really has taken place has been in Finland on this subject matter. It is growing, and there are other trials taking place overseas, but that's for a different day. So this work was a hybrid workshop that took place eventually because of COVID in May. And it's in Basingstoke and Strathspey, which that's just to give you some reference. You've got Aviemore here, you've got Bodegarton, and it goes all the way down to sort of Kincraig area. So we're looking and working with stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, that can be a citizen, it can be a ScotRail, it can be a service provider, it could be a community transport organisation, it could be the Chamber of Commerce. So this is the area that we're focusing on today. Okay. As I say, it was hybrid, and we had people in person from all different sectors, and we had people online, and then I had technology providers. And these technology providers had different types of solutions, and those solutions and tools were all different. But they came from Japan, they came from Sweden, and they came from Scotland. So they were beaming into a room, so you can imagine yourself as the stakeholders in the room wearing whatever hat you've got, and you actually physically got to try all these different technology solutions that are out there, all these apps or desktops that were available. Because at the end of the day, we've all done it before. We've downloaded an app, tried to get it to work, and then deleted it, and that's it, we've walked away. We need to readdress that, and people are really important in this process. I was also very lucky enough to have people come from New Zealand online. So you can imagine the logistics and the methodology having to be implemented to accommodate all these time zones and all these people in different places. And Alex, who's sitting to the left of me here, he was fortunate or unfortunate enough to be in the room with me. So this is a stakeholder map that I've developed, okay? It's got users at the center. So that's whether you're as a visitor to an area, whether you're a business person, or whether you're doing a personal journey. And then you spin out of that and you've got all the different parties and destinations and purposes for trips. These are the type of people that, as I say, were sitting in the room or hybrid. And those that were hybrid, they were still in the room because I gave them a cardboard cutout so that when you're in the room, you actually remember that somebody is there, because it's very easy to forget that people aren't there. So there they are in the room, and there they are as an example in my garden, but they were sitting in the room. Very important. So what did I get them to do over this day? Again, the challenge of being hybrid, and that's what I've got in this box here, okay? On the top right there is something called Padlet, which you may have come across or not. It is an academic piece of software, and it's a great way to do an icebreaker. So you ask people, a day in the life, what is a typical day in life of Jenny Milne? Well, I live in rural Aberdeenshire, I've got 15 acres of land, I've got a child that goes to school, I've got no public transport, I'm a taxi, and I have about 3 different day jobs. That's what I would put down, quite literally. And so this was a great way of bringing people together, because we all did it digitally, so that we had those online and those in person. I then also did these story cubes, and I designed these. That's what they are there. Designed these, very high-tech, not, but those that were online, got a bit of a blue Peter, and they got sent all these delightful story cubes. And there was 3 themes to them. First theme was about different types of users, okay? So on this one here, you've got a student, you've got a couple, you've got somebody with a visual disability, you've got a mum with a pram. Everybody got different ones. Then you also had different destinations. Where are you going? Have you got work? Are you going to a sports club? Are you going shopping? Or there was a magical mystery one you could choose, okay? And the third one, you got a third one, which was about different types of modes of transport, okay? Everybody, whether they're online or in person, had these, and they threw them. And when they threw them, it developed them a persona. So not only were they sitting there looking at the different types of technology as themselves, but they were sitting there thinking about being in somebody else's shoes, which is really important and gave a great conversation. So these countries and these applications and these solutions all came, as I say, from around the world in different formats. Okay, some in Scotland and some in Europe were just simply applications that people were playing with. Somebody would come in online, tell you, download this, you downloaded it, you have a bit of a shot on it, like the Go High app or one for Tactran, you play around with it, you'd ask them questions, and that would be the same whether you were an application or if you're Japan. They're not too keen on applications, they're more focused on desktop, and then in some areas the technology actually was about using your actual telephone. Do you remember that's what the phone's for? Making a phone call, making a text. So they're playing around, they're exploring, and they're using these tools. So how do you capture that data? And this is what I did. I created an evaluation tool. It's not just for mobility as a service, and it's touching on what we were mentioning before we started. It's actually about designing technology for everybody. So you could take this, because I've worked in ITS for a long time, you could take this to look at bus priority or electric vehicle installations, anything that's got technology in it. So first question we asked them once they'd used the application, for better reference at the moment, is what stakeholders did you expect to be involved in this? Okay, it's quite interesting because not many people expect your local authority to be involved. They expect all your modes of transport to be involved. what activities and modes were on that desktop or that application, because some of them had walking, some of them didn't have walking, some of them had local shops involved in them, some of them had goods and services that you could commission. So what was there? Then, really interestingly, what problems do you think this was actually going to address, this solution in front of you? And that obviously ties in with issues to do with how usable it was, what value it gave to you, and really how much impact was this make on your day-to-day difference of work, or going to taking the kids to school, or your journeys, or even going for weekends. And what do you think this looks like in the future, and how can it be? So everybody online and in person looked at these tools for every single, we had 7 of them, 7 different technology solutions. Then at the end, I revisited some of these with a slightly different aspect. So now they're sort of in the gist of it. Who do they really think should be at the table under the key stakeholders? Then I also wanted them, because they're different people, to rank the type of services that were important to them. So one person might want the bus because it's really important. Somebody might want parking, and it's 10. The piece that was really insightful is the society readiness. How actually ready are those people that have been involved, ready for this technology and for taking the next steps to be able to go ultimately towards decarbonising transportation? How would they actually want to pay for this? Because we all keep saying to people, oh, you want to bundle this together like your TV and your phone and all the rest of it. But actually, do we want to do that? Do we want to be using PayPal? Do we want to have a dedicated account? Do we want to be able to use cash? Again, looking at the demographics and the stakeholders, there are differences in this. How can we actually make this a sustainable business model? It's the key question to transport, isn't it? How do we run things without subsidy always being there? How do we want to be engaged and communicated with when we get an app or a desktop and we immediately go to hit the delete button because it doesn't work? But more importantly, who do you think this is actually going to work for, and how is it going to work? The value piece is a presentation in itself, because what is the value of technology? I think we could all go down to the pub and have a conversation on that one. But where is the value for you as that person or that persona that came along to that workshop? So that brought me to all this analysis, and you can imagine my living room floor had quite a lot of paperwork strewn all over it. The value of it really comes down to each individual and their journeys, and you have to analyse that journey. And I'm only going to give you an insight just now, because the granular detail is still being worked on. The stakeholders are being passionate about this. Not one of them said they didn't want this form of transportation coming to the area. They could see value in bringing new modes of transport to the area and new business to the area, particularly when you talking about the visitor economy. The money side of things, not one person said that they were willing to pay more to take a bus because it was through an app or a desktop. They were expecting others to be financing that, whether that was government, whether it was the provider, or whether actually it's the community. Does the community pay for it, and how does the community pay for it? We were also looking in the analysis about what type of model you use. Is it actually about putting the car at the centre and it's an asset, and the people that live in rural areas who can't afford a car but can still access a car and you work out? Or is it actually about plugging the gaps from public transport and public transit? These two pictures come from a gentleman in Canada who's developed these, looking at mobility as a service in an urban area, and I've spun it around for the rural area. And finally, society readiness. How ready actually are we? And the data is showing that out of 1 to 10, everybody, whether you were somebody with a visual disability or whether you were ScotRail, are putting urban at 6.5 and rural at 3. So there's a big, big difference here. And the customer support, everybody wanted 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they wanted to be able to have somebody to speak to at the end of a phone, or a bot, you're smiling away, a bot that doesn't actually just say the same things on, but puts you to somebody on a live chat. They wanted real people. So to conclude, some lovely pictures. I'm well known for this picture because this one to me is about, we always talk about mobility as a service, getting rid of a car. This actually is in Tomental, 2 miles away, but there's a Ford on your right-hand side and the farmhouse is on the right from that. And they have to have one car, this one, to go through the Ford to get to their farmhouse, so it's not MOT'd or tested. And this one is in there to stop the sheep attacking it because it is MOT'd and tested and needs to be able to get down to the shop. To me, mobility as a service is about that use of that car and how that car is used to be able to do the journeys. It's not about getting rid of that car. So for a couple of years, if you see me online, that is where it's been. And that's Aviemore train station at night. So what do I want to conclude from the work at high level at the moment? Really that you can do hybrid interactive tools with an array of users to help design and look at technology. And by giving them identifiable personas to make people think of different feet that they're standing in really did open up some of the evaluation. Making sure that you collaborate with the end user and the citizen, because none of what we were talking about earlier when I asked the question is going to happen if the end user isn't actually part of that process. And we need to make sure that the technology meets all our uses. It's pointless otherwise. You need to have an evaluation framework. You'll be amazed. Very few mobility as a service projects, pilots globally have ever actually evaluated from start to finish. There's one or two, and that's in urban areas. So we need to make sure that we've got a flexible evaluation framework and that it works again from a bottom up and considers the user, and that customer service is key. How many of us use different flights and different shops because of the level of customer service, and it's sort of swinging around. So that's a high level journey through what was quite a challenging workshop to pull off, because it was meant to happen last year and didn't, and then was meant to happen again at the beginning of this year, and then we all got COVID again. So we got there in the end, but I hope it shared some insights into a different way of thinking about decarbonising and coming from the bottom up approach. So that's
Thanks,
it.
Jenny. I found interesting the inclusion in New Zealand as part of rural Scotland.
Yeah, so New Zealand had
quite
New Zealand, because of their geography, but also because of the way they've set up their mobility as a service, as a marketplace, it was, yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Great.
So, questions?
Yeah. So, don't need that. It's all right.
They've
No,
recorded.
because
Recorded, yeah. Might want to.
Yeah, very straightforwardly. Have you heard of the Intelligent Mobility Travellers Needs Survey?
Yes. Yes.
So that is it, really. I mean, that is just such a fantastic example of what you're talking about.
Yep.
And so well implemented. Now, of course, out of date, but not completely out of date. I would just recommend it to anybody else who wants to get into this area anyway.
Yep.
Really.
There's not that much information out there. That is the only one that you can actually latch on to.
Yeah.
And it's how many years out of date now?
It's
I've
about
lost
5 years
I was going to say, is it not new? 10
No,
years?
10 years about that.
10
but
years.
The information is so rich, though.
Yep.
Does anybody know of it? Does anybody at all know of it? I think it was UCL, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So it was a £3 million survey of travellers' needs rather than transport. And it was about linking travellers' needs to the journey types that they made and the times and the places that they did it in, whether rural, urban or whatever. And it was just so well done. And the survey statistics were all laid out very beautifully in a document which is totally free and on the internet. So that's the Intelligent Mobility Travellers Needs Survey if you want to find it.
And I think Alex might correct me if I'm wrong. I think the Connected Places Catapult did something.
Yeah,
2016,
about again,
17.
probably about 4 or 5 years ago. What was Transport Systems Catapult, now Connected Places Catapult, did a similar type of survey and produced, similar types of insights. So yeah, I encourage you. That's all freely available reports that you can download and have a look at.
I think if you're interested in the bottom-up side of things, that's... What is a persona is the question you've got to ask yourself, and that tells you there are many different personas, and different personas for different times, different things.
And we get involved in these jargon, the words of personas, and many people don't know what a persona is. And you're talking to somebody in a workshop, what's a persona? Whereas actually you make it real by they throw the dice, quite literally, and that suddenly becomes a person that they're standing in their feet. You don't need to use the word persona.
It's really surprised people haven't read it. It's quite, or don't know that, because it's such a influential document.
Thanks, Pat. Other questions? Yep. So if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah. I'm Sanlei from Harvard University. So yes, this is my first time to know this mass in rural area. So what is the difference mass in rural area and mass in urban area in terms of the business, for example, the business model to be developed?
So that's a $50 million question. It genuinely is. So my PhD is part-time, so it completes in 2024. So building on this work, I've also interviewed international governments, 20 international governments around the world. And the problem has been, I'm very open and honest about this, they're trying to take an urban model and implement it in a rural area, expecting it to work, and it's not. So what's different? You will see next year a slide which will have rural urban, because you look at the characteristics, and the characteristics are about easy to pay. Well, can you do that in rural areas? Not really. It's all about parking. parking, visitor areas, hotspots, yes, but parking in general in rural areas, not a big problem. It's about getting rid of the car. Actually, in rural areas, we need a car. Now, as I said earlier, if you go and look at David Gray's work, some of from Robert Gordon's, he will give you some statistics about how actually if you don't own a car or have a license, the most used vehicle is not a bus for somebody living in a rural area, it's a car. So when you start to unpick it all, the difference in mass, whether you're in a rural, suburban and urban area, is actually taking these characteristics, and there's many academic papers out there with characteristics and going, right, how applicable is that to this particular area? So I'll use the word place-based, because mass is actually more about being place-based than it is actually about being urban, rural or suburban, because it's what works in that area. Because some rural areas may have massive parking problems, but on the whole, that's not. But we are looking at smart parking within urban areas as part of mass. So when you start to unpick it, you've also got the challenges about transportation and what types of transport you've got available and what mobility gaps there are in public transport. And go to Japan and you can see the big role that goods and services play in mobility. For me, that's a big change in rural areas. We talk about people and goods because then we're maximising the asset, whether that's an electric bike with a trailer on the back of it or whether it's a car. It's about maximising the asset, whereas in an urban area, you're really more focusing about shifting people's travel behaviour and moving them onto different vehicles and giving them a convenience with a tap in, tap out with a solution.
Yes. So what about the demographic attributes in rural area? It's more special or not? I mean, for example,
it's changing. COVID's changed that. So you've seen a huge influx of people to rural and suburban areas because they don't want to be living in city areas. That's going to probably last, in my guesstimate, about 2 to 3 years. That bubble's going to burst. They're going to realise they can't get their Amazon, they can't get their taxi, they can't get the kids to rugby because it's a 40-mile round trip. They're going to move to suburbia. So the sweet spot's going to be suburbia. The whole argument about we have older people living in rural areas, very true in Japan. They've got a very high age in rural areas. Our rural areas in Britain have changed drastically over the last 10 years demographically, hugely.
Yes, so what about the demand level in urban area? Is high or low?
Demand for...
demand characteristics like how they distributed the people.
If you believe all the evidence that's supposedly been gathered for the projects that are there, whether you're talking Vienna or whether you're talking some parts of the United States or Austria for urban mass, they are trying to say that it's a demand, but the demand is driven by how many downloads they have had.
In our application scenario, for example, in the rural area, if the demand, how about the demand? What kind of demand we want to serve? Use this mass.
That's why we do these workshops.
Okay.
I would say it's very, very big, but it's a hidden thing. It's not understood. So
it's informal.
Rural is not understood, but everybody has to take their children to school. Not everybody lives within 10 miles in a rural area with mountains and things. I mean, I know I had a Nepalese student who had to walk 10 miles over the mountains to get to school. But that's just an extreme example. But most people in my rural area where I live, they travel distances of 20, 30 miles on a regular basis to do the shopping, take their kids to school or whatever it is that they're doing. It's a kind of hidden message about transport.
The word I would use is choice. In an urban area, you've got choice whether you take it or not. In rural areas, you don't have the choice, and you use an informal network. You ask somebody to pick something up for you or take you somewhere. And for mass, that needs to incorporate the informal aspect in rural, because it doesn't. So next year, I promise I'll give you a slide that goes into drill detail on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we have just last question very quickly, if you can.
I think your time's up.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So
Thank
the
you.
second,
Bye-bye.
many thanks, Jane. So the second speaker is Katie Davis. Katie has got a BEng in aeromechanical engineering, and then she decided she converted to electronic and electrical engineering. I think during she did an Erasmus at DTU, and then you discovered that it was important to deal with sustainability and transport networks. So what she's doing currently in her PhD project, which is sponsored by Arnold Clark, is exploring the transition from traditionally fueled cars towards electric vehicles. And the presentation today is about the interaction between the Scottish Government Transport Network vision and the electrical networks. So many thanks, Katie.
Great, thank you. So hi, I'm Katie. I'm just about to start my second year of my PhD at Strathclyde. And yeah, I'm going to talk today about my proposed methodology using system dynamics to try and understand the impact that this sustainable transport policy and vision for the future transport network will have on our power networks and people as well. So I'll start with just a quick background and overview of my research area, and I'll give a quick overview of the Scottish Government transport policy as well. And then I'll go on to talk about system dynamics itself and what I'm proposing to do for my PhD, and wrap up with a wee conclusion at the end as well. So yeah, I mean, as we're all well aware, the Scottish Government have set these legally binding targets to reach net zero by 2045, and also a target to achieve a 75% reduction in emissions compared to 1990 levels by 2030. So transport has actually been identified as quite a significant barrier to achieving these targets, and that's because it is the biggest emitting sector in Scotland. It's accountable for about 37% of all emissions. So that really highlights that decarbonisation of transport will be really critical to achieving our net zero goals. So in line with that, we have the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars coming into force in 2030, and that will likely drive an increase in EV ownership. But it's actually been identified that that won't be enough to meet our emissions targets. So for that reason, the Scottish Government are introducing a new initiative to reduce the car kilometres travelled by 20% by 2030. So this will likely drive an increase in the use of public transport and active travel, so walking, wheeling if you're a wheelchair user, and cycling. And some literature is also talking about the idea that an increase in active travel could drive an increase in the use of what they call rideables. So that's just things like electric bikes, electric scooters, electric skateboards, what have you. The government have also put forward a vision for an equitably accessible public EV charging network, electric vehicle EV, that would support people to engage in active travel and use public transport. But I really feel this vision in itself brings about questions of how can we actually achieve it, firstly, and what impact will it have on our power networks. So just a bit more detail about this 20% car kilometre reduction policy. So the Scottish Government have put forward the route map, so it outlines the key investments and legislation they're introducing to try and achieve the target, but they're also looking for people to do a few key things as well. So they're looking for people to actually have fewer necessary trips to complete through use of sustainable online options. They're looking at people trying to stay local more, so use local facilities rather than travelling far and wide to go and do things. They're looking, as I was saying, for people to use public transport and engage in active travel. And they're also looking for people to combine and share trips. So combining being if you have to do X, Y, Z in a day, do it in one trip rather than 3 separate trips, and sharing being car sharing. As we've been hearing a lot today, the just transition is a really key principle of Scottish Government policy, meaning that we all move together towards net zero, no one gets left behind, and everyone's able to participate in the transition. And for that reason, the 20% target is a target for all of Scotland rather than each individual, because it's acknowledged that certain groups will find it more difficult than others to reduce their car kilometres. Looking now towards the National Transport Strategy, this outlines more broadly the kind of visions and aspirations for the transport network. There's generally a shift away from car-centric policy outlined in this document. So it's noted that certain groups are less likely to have access to cars, so that's mainly women, the disabled, the elderly, and certain ethnic minorities. And also that protected groups are generally disproportionately disadvantaged by the negative impact of cars. So for that reason, public transport and active travel is prioritised in this document. However, it is again acknowledged that the car will still have a role in the future transport network. And again, for that reason, the Scottish Government are putting forward this idea that we'll have an equitably accessible public EV charging network that will help people engage in these other modes of transport. This could perhaps be integrated through low carbon travel hubs and active travel hubs. That's discussed quite a lot in Scottish Government policy, but it is branded as a flexible concept. So there's no standardised kind of idea of exactly what they'll look like yet, but perhaps that would be a way that we could integrate that EV energy infrastructure. But again, for me, the overarching question is what actually are the pathways to achieving these visions, what impact will they have, and how can we investigate that holistically? So that leads me on to system dynamics. So it's a method that is applied quite widely in previous literature in transport policy settings, and it allows for a kind of whole systems approach, if you like. So it lets you incorporate numerical and non-numerical factors that influence the problem. It lets you look at social things, technical things, economic things. And basically it's letting you conduct a time-based modelling of a problem through exploration of the cause and effect relationships between the influential factors in the problem. And the way in this type of modelling that you represent these relationships is through what we call causal loops. So this here is quite a basic example. So if you look to the left-hand side, the chickens and eggs loop, that's showing you that as the number of chickens increase, the number of eggs also increase, and as the number of eggs increase, the number of chickens also increase. So that's called a reinforcing loop. And then if we look to the right-hand side, we can see that as the number of chickens increase, the number of road crossings increase. But unfortunately, as the number of road crossings increase, the number of chickens decrease because they'll not all make it to the other side. So that's called a balancing loop. And that's how we show these relationships in this type of modelling. So to give an example of how it's been applied previously, this here was a study that modelled rural travel emissions in China under 3 separate policy scenarios. So one in which no subsidies were given for EVs, one in which the subsidies increased by 5% annually for EVs, and another in which the subsidies increased by 10% annually. And you can see here they've identified the influential factors in the problem, and the relationships between them have been laid out in this causal loop fashion. So by inputting some key data and defining the relationships between the variables, the rural travel emission trends were able to be projected through this type of modelling. And the key finding in this study, which I thought was quite interesting really, was that under that third scenario there, the subsidies increasing by 10% annually, they were actually projecting to eliminate fuel vehicles in rural China by 2030. So this leads me on to what I'm proposing to create. So I'm proposing to apply this system dynamics technique to that 20% car kilometre reduction initiative from the Scottish Government. So I'm trying to assess the pathways that we could achieve that and what the impact they'll have. So this is quite a high level diagram of what I'm proposing to make, but I'm trying to make 3 systems. So the first one here on the left is the mobility system. I want to try and capture the kind of key pillars of that future transport network. And then I want to have a charging system at the top, so that would try and represent like the charging landscape that would support this mobility vision. And then if we go to the right hand side, I want to make a power system, and that would represent our existing infrastructure, so we can try and assess the impact of the mobility and charging systems on the power system. So in the diagram I've got the kind of key variables that I've identified so far, but more sub-variables will be identified. So for example, the proportion of people that work from home will impact the number of necessary trips. The engagement in active travel could impact e-bike usage. So this will allow me to create causal loops like in that example in each of these systems. And then I will create some pathways to achieving the 20% car kilometre reduction target and apply this to the model, and that will hopefully give me the impact that we would have on the power system. So just quickly to wrap up then, to achieve net zero, changes will need to be made in our transport network, and that's mainly a transition towards EVs, but also a modal shift to public transport and active travel. In line with this, the Scottish Government have outlined their 20% car kilometre reduction initiative and the vision for supporting public EV charging network. The pathways to achieving these visions and targets will have consequences for our power networks, and I'm proposing a system dynamics methodology to try and assess these. Given the critical role of transport in achieving net zero, it seems likely that other countries will adopt these similar kind of policy approaches, and in fact we're actually already seeing that happening in Ireland with their sustainable mobility policy. So I think that surely demonstrates the importance of conducting work that will assess the likely impact of these kind of policy approaches. Thanks so much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Many thanks, Katie, for this very interesting and well-delivered presentation.
Thank you.
Congratulations for being able to put a transport element in the chickens example with road crossing. So it's about road safety. Many thanks. So room for questions?
I've got one, if I can.
Yes, please,
Am
Alex.
I allowed to ask a question? Hello. I'm Alex Reid from ETP. I look after all of our zero emission mobility theme. See a few familiar faces that I've met online before. So the question, Katie, is how do you think that what you're doing, and you touched on this I think maybe a little bit last year when you presented, can assist the Scottish Government when it comes to the location of EV charge points, because you very kind of eloquently outlined the interrelationship between the human and the people side, behavioural side, and where EV chargers should be located. So how do you think your study or research might help to aid the location of charge points in the future?
Yeah, so there's a key barrier to EV uptake, of course, is a lot of people won't have their own driveway to charge their own car in, so they have to rely on this public network. I think the way in which this work could help is because it is able to bring in kind of non-numerical and non-classically engineering type indicators to the model. I know that a lot of other work has looked at trying to kind of quantify numerically things like people not having access to chargers at home. I know some work kind of looked at like population density and tried to kind of make that about high density housing and how they likely won't have their own driveway. But yeah, I think it will be able to bring in some kind of indicators like that are maybe non-classical kind of standard engineering ones. But I also think it will bring in room for discussion about these other kind of barriers surrounding the lack of access at home, because it is so much more expensive to charge publicly. So how can we kind of not penalise those that can't charge at home, but at the same time not incentivise people to drive to get cheaper rates, because that would go against that car kilometre reduction kind of initiative, and it is also kind of not really what the public charging network's for. So hopefully that kind of modelling will be able to bring in like a way of capturing all of that.
It looks like what you're doing. It also addresses the grid challenge as well, you know, in terms of where there are lack of capacity on the grid and how that could influence where charge points are located as well. Particularly, you know, rural areas are, you know, tying Jenny's presentation to your presentation, you know, a particular challenge perhaps when it comes to the rollout of more EV charge points. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Sorry, I should have introduced you before.
That's okay.
I took for granted that everybody. Are you
point.
going away? Sorry. I have a question myself and a suggestion as well. The suggestion is, I think, because of what you said in terms of the importance of the equity of the solution that we put in place. I mean, if you could develop your model in such a way that you could capture the equity of the distributions of the impacts, that will be very useful, I guess. And then the other question is a very generic one, but because I've always been fascinated by system dynamics, but I always have the problem, so where do we get the data from? Or how do we calibrate them?
Yeah, so that's my next kind of big question for the PhD, my next big task. But I think data collection will be a really heavy part of it. I think some things are easier to come by than others, and I think a lot of the kind of non-numerical side might have to be guided by maybe like interviews with experts in different kind of realms, and I think that's where I'm really lucky to have the Arnold Clark sponsor, because I know I'll have access to a whole wealth of people with experience in the car kind of landscape as well. But yeah, I think that will be a really big challenge.
Many thanks, good luck. One question there? If you can say your name.
Job Thijssen, University of Edinburgh. Very nice presentation. I couldn't quite see in the whole scheme, is infrastructure part of the, infrastructure quality part of the mix? Because I'm an avid cycler, but it's not a secret that there's certain parts in town where I can't cycle anymore because my wheel will get stuck in a massive hole in the road. So is that part of the mix in the Scottish Government kind of considerations?
I think it is. They have a lot of chat about this active travel kind of stuff, and I think they are putting forward a lot of frameworks for that, because I think that is like the prepared solution. If we could all just be in Copenhagen on our bikes, that would be fab. So yeah, I think they are going to put a lot of stuff forward, and I definitely want to keep up to date on that, because I think that would be like a really interesting thing to bring into the model and to kind of make central, because if that is the kind of central vision that we are mainly using active travel, then that would make sense for that to be a really critical part of the model.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katie.
Perfect, thank you.
And then last but not least, Pat Langdon. Pat is the director of the Transport Research Institute at Napier University. Is a professor of engineering, design, transportation and inclusion, something that you care much about. He's an experimental psychologist, has worked a lot in AI and robotics, engineering design for over 20 years. He's an expert of human factors. In this presentation today is about this very interesting project. Well, the first part of this interesting project, which is called HART, is a hydrogen electric autonomous regional transportation, where they are trying to develop a completely, I think, new model of sub-regional aviation using green energy, let's say.
Correct.
So, but
Thank you very much for that. And people are going to be mystified about that CV, right? So yes, right. I've only got basically 10 minutes, and what we've got is a complex Innovate UK partnership of over 11 consortium partners, now probably going on 13 to 16. But in all, to cut it down to its basic simple elements, it all rotates around this plane, which is the development of Zero Avia. It has electric engine, electric motor engine, and hydrogen fuel cells to drive them. Now, this is a model that Zero Avia has been developing for many, many years, and therefore is heavily engaged in the process of regulation and so on. It's also going to be a flying service by 2024. So we are well down what I would call technology readiness levels here. So this isn't in the same style as a student presentation. I think we've got to accept there's more going on here. And Edinburgh and APO has been lucky enough to take part in this from the start over 18 months ago. So roughly speaking, these are the moving parts. Blue Bear Systems is a company that specialises in drones and autonomous aircraft with defence connections. Zero Avia, I've just talked about, they're a specialist in getting this particular form of zero carbon aviation into the air. Britton Norman, if you didn't know it, is an aircraft company that successfully provides very small aircraft that do a good job of jumping small islands. Inmarsat, we know what Inmarsat is. They provide fantastic space-age communication technologies to using satellites. Highlands and Islands Airports Limited, we know what they do, but they're roughly speaking involved control and running of airports all over Highlands and Islands. Protium is a company specialising in hydrogen solutions, and they're the company in the consortium that will be providing the hydrogen at the aircraft point, or the refuelling point, and Protium is probably the first to do the developments in that area. Fleet on Demand is an MAAS service company which is expanding into this area as well as other areas. It's an important end-to-end solution that they're trying to develop using apps, and it's potentially will include a hydrogen HART project aircraft in it. Weston Williamson and Partner is an architect. Their role is to design the new types of terminals that we would need for the sort of service we're talking about. So the economics of this are that you run small aircraft controlled by, not controlled, but driven by hydrogen fuel cells over relatively short distances, but you do it frequently. And you do it to sub-regional airports, i.e. not big airports. So we design our own terminals. They're designed in a modular fashion so that they can be scaled. And the idea is to do away with a lot of the unnecessary inconveniences of larger terminals, not least of which is inclusion, the difficulty of people, of citizens to get through the modern system. Edinburgh and APO's job was really to look at the acceptability of this to people who are likely to use it, very much in the spirit of the early first presentation. And Loganair is the airline. There are now more than this, but that was I'm reporting on the first project. We've already entered into the second project. Essentially, and I think it's probably clear to say, most people, particularly people who have struggled in airports, are very negative about aviation with respect to zero carbon or low carbon solutions, sustainability and so on. And most of the modelling isn't very helpful in this respect. However, this is really largely due to their being fixated on the older models of service and also the older technologies. What we did when we started 18 months ago as our role is we originally themed the whole thing in terms of the sort of things that are going to be important. I'll go through some of them, but clearly this is from a perspective of the user or the passenger or the traveller. Trust in the technology, safety and security, physical interfaces, operating models, barriers and enablers, journey attributes, attractiveness and pleasure, joy, convenience, willingness to pay, climate change and so forth, and what people's current travel behaviour are the central themes that you have to consider. And in fact, I did borrow some of these from the Travellers' Needs Survey because it makes it clear that if you don't understand users' journeys, you don't understand users' joy, pleasures and difficulties, then you'll not understand the demand for a service like this. We also have to include necessity journeys, other aspects, age, gender, income, geographical location, social demographics, and quite importantly too, social norms, expectations about employment and so forth. Over that, overall, the main underlying themes we wanted to penetrate the public opinion about is hydrogen aviation, automated pilot aircraft, sub-regional transport, and integration with other transport modes. Those are the key elements to this economics of this model, and those are the ones that we addressed as a approach. So methodology was quite demanding methodology. So initially, after the work we just discussed, literature reviews in general, and we take that as interpreted information and used it to conduct interviews with the consortium themselves, who largely are experts in the area they work in, maybe not academic experts. And we then combined that with information from other stakeholders to give, and rotated it through the consortium feedback to develop a national survey for Scotland. The national survey contained items of various sorts related to the things I've discussed, so I won't go into more detail about that. But we also conducted a series of public focus groups in Edinburgh and on the islands, and we combined that data with the responses from the survey, basically to produce interpreted analysis, an integrated interpreted analysis, and that was the end product which we have reached. So the survey was a fairly large survey, somewhere in the region of 1,000 responses. It was done over a stratified sample of Scotland. It was cognitively tested. It was live 21 during the periods of the late 21, and it contained various different items. But the key thing was we felt it necessary to be able to convey to the potential respondents really what it is all about, what you would do if you were a passenger. Yes, concept, you take it from the moment they're sitting on the couch, people are sitting on the couch and want to go somewhere, to the moment they arrive in their taxi at the other end. And the sort of thing that might happen might be something like this. Now you'll notice this is all hand-drawn. So this approach is an early stage storyboard that we did for the project, but we happened to think it was a good idea to put this into the survey to contextualise what the questions were about in the survey. And it proved to be quite a successful approach. However, we also had to think seriously about important aspects of the project, one of which is the terminal. So the whole service really is dependent upon quite a novel concept of small, inclusive and robotic terminals. And this is what we originally started to work on. I'm not saying this is the design. In fact, this person who drew this knows nothing about the actual design. But this was drawn by that person who's very skilled. And the idea is you arrive here in your Uber, on your scooter or cycle, whatever it is. You go straight through you drop any luggage you have here, go straight through the terminal, which is essentially transparent. There are no real barriers. Walk through a security gate and then go to your gates or go to the WC or go to a vending machine. And then ultimately you go straight onto your plane in a relatively short order. And the point about this is that you do it level. There are no steps, there are no changes inside and so forth. So the idea is it's inclusive in that sense, and it will also be inclusive in a much wider sense, which is whether or not you understand what you're doing, whether or not you can move fast or slow, whether you can see, whether you can hear, and whether you can have, basically have all the other aspects of inclusion. It relies on lots of technology, particularly, for example, robotic handling. And one of the partners in the new project is RDM, who are RDM, who are actually a designer of robotic equipment. Some things we got back on the survey. I haven't got time to go into all of the survey. There were 39 items in all. But these are the sort of things that are important. Do the demographics match up to, for example, the Scottish records data? And as you can clearly see, they do. What about things like, for example, hydrogen responses to, or familiarity with hydrogen? And the answer is to that is that there is not a great deal of familiarity with hydrogen. And also, if you look at it in terms of age bands, then that is much lower in the older age groups. An entirely predictable result, but it's just to show this is the sort of thing that we were asking. And in our statistical modelling, we take these base demographics and we combine them with all the other variables in the survey to produce an interpreted result. How do we do that? We use quite a complex form of probit analysis that is specialised by some of our lecturers in the Transport Research Institute that allows us to do a very powerful analysis of random parameters and how the responses across the parameters vary. In short, it goes further than normal probit analysis, for example, and it takes you into the possibility that not everybody within a statistical group does the same thing, and it allows that. And that's distributed non-homogeneity, I think is what it's called. And it allows us to create quite a powerful analysis that goes a little bit deeper than just the normal correlation-based modelling. So this is the sort of thing you get out of it. It's very interesting. You choose what we call response variables that are important, such as, for example, how frequently would you use a survey like this, a service like this? And the sort of thing you get is things like this. So business trips, the likelihood business trip reduction due to CODIV, annual household income and how that relates to your frequency of use, connections for business trips, familiarity with hydrogen, agreement with the statement, I expect toilet facilities on board the plane no matter how long the journey is. Really, really important stuff from the point of view of the users and the point of view of all the thematic issues that I mentioned earlier on. And effectively, we then use that to make an interpreted result or a report, if you like. And that is where I stop, because we have the report, it's complete, delivered, and we are essentially publishing that as soon as we finish the academic version. But in the meantime, we have been lucky to receive more funding, so now project is now rolling on for for a further 2 years.